So we are here talking about faith and democracy, 2024. What's the question? What was that? What's at stake? So what is at stake as we gather here? Everything? Our whole way of life? Anything else? Democracy? Freedom? The gospel? Inclusivity? Safety? Survival? What? Sanity. Oh, wow. I thought we already lost that. But here we are. So what is at stake? Democracy. Woo! Okay, if we keep going, I think we just have to go home. But what's at stake also is, if we think about the one thing that moves us forward, right? We come here with anticipation and, it's a four-letter word, hope, right? What's at stake is if we don't enter this conversation, if we don't put ourselves right in the middle of it and look around, we won't have that hope, right, that propels us forward. We have hope as people of God, right? We have hope. There are those out there on the margins who have never had the luxury of living with the hope that most of us in this room do. So it's our job, right, to be propelled forward, to use that hope as the catalyst. So we have some hopeful and some difficult news, right, as people of faith. And we're going to hear some of that from Dr. Perry this morning. He's a remarkable thinker and scholar, a leading voice in the study of white Christian nationalism, whose work challenges us to see the complex ways that religion intersects with race, politics, and culture in America today. In this moment, in these moments, in this decade of polarization, really, and unrest, Dr. Perry's research offers clarity and insight, helping us understand how these dangerous ideologies are not only shaping our political landscape, but threatening the very fabric of American life. And some would say, maybe someone last night in a red dress would say, that this isn't new, right, in America. We have a lot of unlearning to do. But right now, we're going to look to data, to research, to integrity, to the story that we really can't turn away from. Dr. Perry is the co-author of the groundbreaking book, The Flag and the Cross, White Christian Nationalism and the Threat to American Democracy, which exposes how this ideology construes the heart of both faith and democracy, fueling division, exclusion, and injustice. So let us take a deep breath, because we're going to need it. But remember, I want you to look for hope today, right? If you were sort of needing some help, sit with a friend who seems like they're a little bit happier. But put those pieces together, because we are leaving this place today with hope as our anchor. So join me in welcoming this morning Dr. Samuel L. Perry from Oklahoma City.
Good morning. Hear me okay? Okay. What a privilege it is to be here. I have so many people to thank just for the invitation, and this has been just tremendous to just be a part of this. It is my privilege to join you, but I've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's just jump in, right? I come to you today as a sociologist, a social scientist, and principally, and that means I am primarily concerned with data. I am also a Christian, somebody who cares deeply about what goes by the name Christian. I would like that. I would prefer that to be to reflect my understanding of what Jesus himself embodies in the gospel of love and tolerance and acceptance and justice for those who are marginalized. And yet I understand that is that very narrative, that very understanding of what it means to be a Christian is challenged, and we see that challenged around the country. But I want to speak to you not as a theologian or as a pastor, though I'm a seminary graduate and trained as a pastor. I want to come to you and speak to you a little bit about what the data tell us from the social sciences about white Christian nationalism, how we understand this, and its impact on our democracy and the way that we see one another, and some potential solutions for the way we can address this ourselves in the future. It used to be a few years ago, we started studying this phenomenon, white Christian nationalism, around at least 10 years ago. I still have the emails from those initial correspondences where we started looking at some data and wondering what it is we had here and trying to understand this ideology that seems to impact people's politics and culture and their racial attitudes in really powerful ways, and we didn't quite understand it. But over those 10 years, initially when we started talking about this thing, Christian nationalism, the initial response is, that's not a thing. You just made that up, right? That is just a leftist slur word that sociologists came up with or journalists came up with to try to keep conservative Christians from being able to vote. Right? We really had to get people to attention. Talk about this thing called Christian nationalism. That is no longer a thing we have to do. People are already talking about Christian nationalism a lot. But in fact, it is not sociologists and journalists and social scientists who have made this term popular. In fact, we find that the most attention that has been gathered towards this phenomenon of Christian nationalism comes not from sociologists or even the publications of our books. This is Google Trends data from 2004 when they started collecting these data. This is how many people search for a term like Christian nationalism, leading up to basically last month. And what we find is the times where people search for this thing called Christian nationalism are not in response to the publication of my book, sadly, or any of the things that we put out. It is actually things like in January 2021, it was the Capitol riots. And the summer of 2022 is Marjorie Taylor Greene taking to Twitter and recording a video of herself saying that the Republican Party ought to be the party of Christian nationalism. After that, there was an example, a Politico journalist, Heidi Przybyla, who actually gave an example of something I want to talk about today in really, I think, mislabeling things Christian nationalism, talking about Christian nationalism in a sense that is just reflecting of like maybe conservative Christians and the way they think about politics, which is not necessarily Christian nationalism. And so a lot of people search for the term after that. But then the most popular one is Josh Hawley, Senator Josh Hawley from the state of Missouri, who this summer at NatCon in July also was recorded on record saying that I've been called a Christian nationalist and so I am. He owned the label. So actually the most attention gathered to this topic has actually come from right-wing politicians and right-wing political events. In my own state of Oklahoma, where I live, within the last year, this is Google search terms and how often a state comes up or how often this takes place in a particular state. And you will notice that in my state of Oklahoma is the darkest blue. That is not thanks to me, sadly. I've been talking about Christian nationalism for a long, long time. That is thanks to my state superintendent of public instruction, Ryan Walters. And you might have heard his name. And can we just agree that people in other states shouldn't know the name of your state superintendent of public education? Unless it is for some kind of miraculous change in raising the educational outcomes of K through 12 students in public education. Other than that, you shouldn't know who they are, but everybody knows who Ryan Walters is now because he has spent the last several years of his administration working to get the Ten Commandments put in public schools, working to get Bibles put in public schools. Most recently, he asked the state for $6 million to put Bibles in public schools. And it became known in a very popular viral news report yesterday in the Oklahoman that those Bibles, that the money was going to go to purchase Trump Bibles, right? Like to purchase the Bibles that God make, the God Bless America Trump Bibles with Lee Greenwood. I don't know if you guys saw these. Okay, so that is the kind of thing going on. This is not something that I can only, I am envious of the attention that Ryan Walters is able to draw towards Christian nationalism as a phenomenon. And I think he is embodying the very kinds of things that I want to talk about today. My talk outline, just to give you an insight into what I want to talk about, is first we're going to look at what is and isn't white Christian nationalism. I want to be very careful about defining those terms because I think as the term itself grows in popularity, there is a risk of it losing meaning, right? It just becomes a catch-all category that we just call things, right? So I want to be very specific in how we're talking about this. Second, what does it matter for 2024? It matters greatly. It has mattered greatly. This is not a new thing. As we talk about in our book, The Flag and the Cross, it is older than the nation itself, and yet it has very specific implications for our discourse leading up to the presidential election and afterward. And lastly, how do we respond? The last third of my talk, I really want to spend on how, what I think the social sciences teach us about, or what are some productive ways to respond to these kinds of things, these polarizing ideologies that threaten American democracy. So first, what is and isn't white Christian nationalism? There are two dangers in discussing white Christian nationalism and defining it. The first is that we become so broad in defining Christian nationalism that we include people like Martin Luther King Jr., and any Christians who want to vote their values. So Martin Luther King Jr. would occasionally say, for example, in his letter from a Birmingham jail, he would make reference to our founding values or a Christian nation. He would use that phrase, or the religious values of our founders. And he didn't have in mind anything close to what we conceive of today as white Christian nationalism. His idea was justice and aspirational tolerance, the kind of nation that we ought to be. And so I don't think we ought to define it in such a way as to where we would include Martin Luther King Jr. But the other side of the spectrum is that we become so narrow in how we define white Christian nationalism that we're really only talking about 5 people, right? Like we're only talking about the QAnon shaman and other extremists who would go storm a Capitol. It actually is far bigger than that. We're talking in the millions and more, and especially among influential politicians and a lot of people who are very motivated politically, militantly so. And so we've got to define it in a way that includes the right people and excludes this broad audience of people that we really don't want to include in that category. So first, what isn't white Christian nationalism before I get to defining it? First, I want to stress that white Christian nationalism does not necessarily mean white evangelicals. Now, I will admit that within the last 10 years, the Venn diagram of white evangelical and white Christian nationalism is becoming a circle, right? Like those things, it is becoming more difficult for me to say that phrase with integrity, that these two things are not the same. And yet, we know that they're not the same. I think I have many relationships in my own life of white evangelicals who are pulling their hair out about this thing and are truly bothered by it. Now, statistically speaking, they are a minority, a very small minority of that population. But I don't mean to stress that every time I say white evangelicals, or I don't mean to give the impression that every time I say white evangelical, I mean white Christian nationalists and vice versa. I think one is an ideology, right, that we're going to talk about. And so we actually, when we just kind of collapse those categories and then we say that white Christian nationalism means white evangelical, we're actually leaving out a lot of traditional Catholics and white mainline Protestants and other people in the United States who also sign on to this ideology of white Christian nationalism. So it muddies the waters when we try to imply that one is the other. White Christian nationalism also does not mean Christian patriotism. I actually think Christian patriotism is a good thing. Count me among the scholars who would consider patriotism something different from nationalism, definitely, like categorically. They are not the same thing. You can think of Timothy Snyder and Jill Lepore, George Orwell, the famous writer who wrote a book called On Nationalism, or a series of essays on nationalism. He draws a distinction between nationalism being something that is inherently selfish, inherently us versus them, and us better than them. Patriotism, in my mind, as I understand it, is about neighborliness. It is about stewardship. It is about a responsibility to make my community better and my nation better, and feeling a sense of responsibility for that. I think that is a good thing. I think that's a Christian thing, right? And so Christian patriotism is not implicated in Christian nationalism. I think these two things are quite different. White Christian nationalism does not mean recognizing positive Christian influence in the United States. It is okay to recognize that Christians have been good in the United States. Like, there have been good values shared. Christians have done good things. That's okay. That does not make you a Christian nationalist to say that, like, look, these Christian values and these Christian communities have served, have influenced society for the better, have stopped bad things. It is okay, and not Christian nationalism, to say, you know what, we could recognize some of those positive things as well. And lastly, white Christian nationalism does not mean Christians getting involved in politics, as if that was even possible. Right? Like to check your religious values at the door completely. We don't ask anybody else to do this, and that is a fair concern that people who I would say really do fall under the category of white Christian nationalists, their response, and this is really kind of a whataboutism form, what about the black church? What about white mainline or liberal Protestants or progressive Christians? Aren't they engaged in some kind of leftist form of Christian nationalism? And I don't think that is in any way what I'm talking about, because I think Christian values influencing our politics does not necessarily lead to anti-democratic results. It doesn't mean to subverting electoral democracies. It doesn't mean to lead to intolerance necessarily, that we want to exclude entire groups of people from participating or make sure that there are institutionalized hierarchies among people. That is white Christian nationalism, but that is not Christians getting involved in politics. So I want to be clear, lest I be accused of using Christian nationalism as some kind of a slur, right? I don't want that. I don't want Christian nationalism to become the left's version of the word woke, right? You know what I'm talking about, right? Like, the word woke is meaningless. It means nothing. It is pure slur now, right, from the right. Everything I don't like to the left of me is woke. It's woke gender ideology, it's woke CRT, it's woke DEI, it's anything that you attach to, anything on the left of you that you do not like. That is a pure slur. I don't want Christian nationalism to be that. I want it to be understood as a very specific set of things so we can actually diagnose it. So what is that? What is white Christian nationalism? We can think about it as at least three things. And I don't mean to be evasive there. Like, I'm not saying it can mean all of these things. I think we can really talk about it in three registers. First, white Christian nationalism, the way we usually refer to it is an ideology, a political ideology, a set of values and beliefs and myths that shapes our political attitudes and behaviors. Now, the way we try to usually get at this in our statistical analyses is we conduct national surveys and we ask Americans how much they agree with statements that we think are pretty fair indicators of Christian nationalism. So I'm going to give you some examples of that. So in the flag and the cross, we divide up these measures into ideas of what we call a deep story of Christian nationalism. That is a set of myths about our special relationship with God as a nation. And then the vision of Christian nationalism, and we've also included some new measures about identity and who the nation is. So these are some examples. America has a special place in God's plan. I consider founding documents like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution to be divinely inspired. That is a myth, a sacred story, a deep story about our special relationship. God likes us best. He has chosen us as his nation. Then we have this idea of a vision. What do Christian nationalists want? The federal government should declare the U.S. a Christian nation. The Bible should be the foundation of our legal system. Christians have a responsibility to gain control over national institutions like the government and education and media. And I consider being a Christian an important part of being truly American. So what we do is we allow people to rate how much they agree with that from, say, 0 to 4, and then we add up responses to those to make a scale. And so higher scores on that scale means you are in complete agreement with Christian nationalism. In the middle means you're ambivalent, and lower scores means you largely reject that. And so we look at how people score on that, and we see how it corresponds with various attitudes towards democracy, tolerance, various forms of exclusion and inequality. And as you might guess, those things really respond in just as you would assume. But here's the interesting thing, and this is why we actually call it white Christian nationalism. Why do I throw that word in there? I've been talking about Christian nationalism. Why do I call it white Christian nationalism? And we've been moving towards stressing that what we are indeed talking about is not just this generic Christian nationalism. It really is white Christian nationalism. I don't do that to make it sound scary. Right? I don't do it to make it sound racist and to give it a negative valence as something that is really bad. Oh, it's white Christian nationalism. That must make it really bad and racist, like white nationalism. No, it's actually because we find in study after study after study that when white Americans affirm our measures of Christian nationalism, they mean profoundly different things than people of color do. It is because our religious identities and experiences in the United States are fundamentally racialized. They are shaped by our racial experience, and so white Americans, when they think largely, and this is just average, I'm talking about trends here, when they think about Christian heritage, Christian values, Christian nation, they seem to have something completely different in mind than, say, African Americans do when they affirm the same kinds of questions. Let me give you an example. And I've got, again, this is from study after study after study in every data set we've ever collected on this topic. So here is the percentage, the predicted percentage. What I'm doing is I'm statistically controlling for educational outcomes, income, region of the country, your party, ideological identity, all those kinds of things, gender, everything. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to isolate the relationship between Christian nationalist ideology and this particular outcome. And here I'm looking at the predicted percentage of white and black Americans who believe that the 2020 presidential election was stolen from Donald Trump. So notice across the bottom you have our Christian nationalism scale. As people score higher on Christian nationalism, notice what happens to black Americans. They don't change at all. Right? It does not affect their belief that the election was stolen from Trump in 2020. But for white Americans, look at that. That's what we call a linear association. Right? As one thing moves up, Christian nationalism, the other thing, belief that the 2020 election was stolen from Trump, also moves up. Why would that happen? Why? We've already controlled for, statistically in this analysis, I've already controlled for your party identity. I've controlled for whether you're conservative or liberal, your education. There seems to be some connection that white Americans make between a country that belongs to us, rightfully belongs to us and is being taken from us, and the belief that the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump. Let me give you another example. And this one is a little bit more scary. This is the predicted percentage of white and black Americans who agree that true American patriots may have to resort to physical violence in order to save our country. Notice that as Christian nationalism increases, Black Americans, you see a lot of noise. There's not a statistically significant increase in their belief there. But for white Americans, again, you see this takes off, especially at higher values of Christian nationalism. For some reason, the more white Americans, and not any other group, the more white Americans affirm Christian nationalist views, the more likely they are to hold views that I can't trust democracy, that the presidential election is unfair and unjust and stolen, that we are the victims, that white people in particular are the victims, and that true American patriots may have to resort to physical violence in order to save our country. That's deeply problematic, but it is specific to white Americans, right? And that is why we call it white Christian nationalism. It's not to make it sound scary. It is because empirically, this is exactly what we're looking at, okay? So Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism is a political ideology. It is also an emerging identity that shapes attitudes and behavior. This is something that is more new. White Christian nationalism as an ideology is something that is older than the nation itself, right? It would have been before our nation's founding, the idea that the nation rightfully belongs to Anglo-Protestant British people and not Native Americans or Black people or Catholics or that kind of, like that is older than the nation itself. But the phenomenon of people going around calling themselves Christian nationalists is rather a new phenomenon, and it has been a response largely to the public outcry against Christian nationalism, to us labeling this thing a thing. What we have had is really like a basket of deplorables kind of move within the last few years where people are really embracing the label. Now that can be potentially scary. Like I go back and forth, honestly, because part of me says, I like calling this out. I like people being honest about who they are and what they believe so that I don't have to kind of deal with fakeness and just kind of like, you think this, but you don't let me know until you actually vote on Tuesdays. You know, like I want to know it, but at the same time, identities have power, right? Identities have power. And the more I call myself this and not that, the more I get together with other groups who identify collectively as this thing, those identities start to take on power. What's been going on within the last couple of years is that Christian Americans on the far right, have started to embrace this so much so that they're writing books. In the fall of 2022, 2 years ago, there were 2 books that came out, one by Stephen Wolfe, the other one by Andrew Torba. Andrew Torba is the founder of the free speech platform Gab and a notorious anti-Semite. Stephen Wolfe, as somebody who is also an unsavory character, he's gone on record to say that he believes the 19th Amendment, the one that gave women the right to vote, should be repealed. That interethnic marriage is a special kind of sin. And when you follow his theology, that actually makes sense to him, right? So like, if he believes, and which he does, he argues in his book, I've read these books. So like, what he does is he argues in his book that God intended nations, before the fall, God intended nations to be separate and different, and God likes nations, and he likes ethnic distinctiveness for some reason. And so if you believe that that is good pre-fall and something that God always intended, then interethnic marriage really violates that. It kind of blurs. It's a very Bob Jones University kind of like reaction to one worldism and globalism. It's that kind of thing. It's that theology. It's a segregation theology that we would have seen in the 1950s. So it is, in some ways, it's a gift that these 2 guys are the ones who are writing these books because they are about everything. I could almost be accused of planting these people. They are so like over the top, radical Christian nationalists and everything that they espouse, the anti-Semitism, the racism, the sexism, all of those kinds of things. And yet they are, in fact, people. And it is becoming not just Marjorie Taylor Greene and Josh Hawley, but it is something that others are embracing as well. In my own state of Oklahoma, now obviously this doesn't stigmatize you in Oklahoma because we just have people like this everywhere. This is Dusty Devers, who is a state senator, and he has co-authored a book or a statement called Christian Nationalism and the Gospel, along with other self-espoused Christian nationalists. And so the more this thing takes off as people actually identifying and embracing the label, there is potential for this to have even more power in a really nefarious way. Lastly, Christian nationalism can be understood, white Christian nationalism can be understood as a political strategy that aims to activate that ideology and identity with rhetoric and wants to institutionalize white Christian supremacy. How do you activate white Christian nationalism? Well, you can do that in ways that, say, people like David Barton have done with the ministry Wall Builders, who basically that is an organization that exists to provide Christian nationalist factoids to pastors and politicians and anybody who is interested to read. But you can do it even more powerfully by talking about threats to Christians and threats to white Christians. We find in recent experimental evidence, in experiments that we've run, survey experiments with national samples, that telling white Christians about Christianity's numerical decline and replacement makes them more supportive of Christian nationalism and Donald Trump. We find when you tell them that Christians are declining in number, that the population, the electoral majority is swinging towards another group, that they feel threatened and they feel like, okay, Christian nationalist ideology is a way you circle the cultural wagons. It's a way that you assert who this nation rightfully belongs to, and you unify around that idea. We need to take it back, right? Like, we need to defend our interests, our values, and unapologetically Christian ways and Christian supremacist kind of ways, not to promote tolerance or for all religions, but really this idea of kind of Christian values and bringing them back. So here's an example of that. This is from this year. This is the Republican platform published. You can look at this. You can Google in 5 seconds. The 2024 presidential or the Republican platform they put out for Trump. Now, at the beginning of this, it talks about in very kind of generic language about religious liberty, how the Republican Party will value religious liberty. First Amendment, religious liberty. You see halfway through, our ranks include men and women from every faith and tradition, and we respect the rights of every American to follow his or her deeply held beliefs. To protect religious liberty, what are they going to do to protect religious liberty for all of these different faith traditions that we want to help? No, he says, to support religious liberty of all of these faith traditions, we're going to support a new federal task force to fight anti-Christian bias that will investigate all forms of illegal discrimination, harassment, and persecution against Christians in America. No, right? Like, so notice the implication there, right? Like, is who's targeted? Who feels threatened? Well, it's Christians. They're not investigating anti-Muslim bias. They're not even investigating anti-Semitism, which might, like all of these things are right on the forefront of a lot of our conversations right now. And yet the focus is we're going to make sure that we organize task force to defend Christians against that kind of persecution. My own state superintendent of public instruction spends most of his days videotaping himself in his car talking about these kinds of things, or tweeting out, or giving interviews on Fox News, which he actually has a Christian nationalist publicity firm that makes sure he gets on all of these shows by the guy who is one of the project managers for Project 2025. This is all connected with these things as well. But Ryan Walters, notice some of the language that he uses. I'll never stop defending Judeo-Christian values. Fighting against state-sponsored atheism. All of the state-sponsored atheism in Oklahoma, which, as everybody knows, is just the most leftist state that we have outlawed. The Ten Commandments are vital to understand America's roots. This was a bill that we got the Ten Commandments mandated in every public school classroom in a prominent place, framed. And my wife is a elementary school teacher, so these are conversations that we have a lot. Instilling these values will create better citizens, a Christian nationalist statement, that if we make sure that all 10 commandments are posted there, that will make better citizens. Atheists, this is one that he posted like 3 days ago. Atheists and the radical left have driven Bibles out of the classrooms. In Oklahoma, we are putting it back in. So again, there's this idea that we are under attack, Christians are under attack, Christian values are under attack, and we are fighting against it from the state, from the government, making sure that we defend those kinds of priorities and values. Why does this matter? If you were not already convinced that this matters, why does it matter for the 2024 election and the things that we're facing now? Well, the reality is America is becoming more religiously and ethnically diverse, not less. Right? We are becoming less and less a white Christian nation. So what does that mean? It means white American Christians who want to reinstitutionalize the supremacy of white American Christians increasingly have to do that in a context in which electoral demographics do not favor them, do not favor that agenda. In fact, most Americans want less influence of religion on politics, not more. This is taken from Gallup, and I've got lots of data to support this. This is something that I can show you in survey after survey that tracks Americans over time, but this is just the one from Gallup. From 2001 to 2020, this is the percentage of Americans who are dissatisfied with the religion's influence in the U.S. and what they would prefer. You see across the bottom, those two lines that are flat are those who are dissatisfied and they want more, and they're dissatisfied and they want the same. Most Americans who are dissatisfied with religion's role in American politics want less consistently, right? So that is a pattern that we see across the board. Most Americans, or most Americans who have a problem with the way religion's relationship with politics works, would actually prefer less, right? Not more Christian nationalism. So what happens? To overcome 1 and 2, white Christian nationalism must co-opt or neutralize the growing number of Americans who don't want it. How? Well, what do you do? And this is what I tell my students. Political science isn't rocket science. In some ways, it's harder because people are really hard to predict. We don't have hard and fast laws like the laws of physics and thermodynamics and those kinds of things. But in some ways, when human beings only have a few options, they're actually pretty easy to predict. And so one of those situations is, what do you do when your numbers and popularity are declining, but you still have to win electoral majorities? A really famous political scientist at Harvard named Daniel Ziblatt, maybe some of you have read his book called How Democracies Die. Before How Democracies Die, he was famous for another concept that he wrote called the conservative dilemma. Now, I wish he hadn't called it the conservative dilemma, because I don't mean to give the impression that all conservatives think like this, but he called it the conservative dilemma. The conservative dilemma is this. When you are conservative in any nation, not just in the United States, but elsewhere around, historically, your position is such that where you defend institutionalized power, those people who have held power historically. And that could be people like the monarchy, it could be people who are wealthy, it could be class power, it could be land power, it could be racial power, it could be religious power, but you are conservative, so you basically defend elite power historically. Well, in an electoral democracy, you face a challenge, because as demographics change, and you are still committed to defending institutional elite power, those who have had the money, those who have had the power, religious power, white power, you face a challenge, and that is, how do you get electoral majorities in a demographic that's changed? That's the conservative dilemma. And it's a conservative dilemma in the United States. You only have a few options. One, you could stick to your guns and just die off. Two, you could change, but that stinks. Why would you want to change, right? Like, they're the ones who are wrong. So that's lame. I never want to change. So what do you do if you don't want to change and you don't want to stick to your principles and die off? Well, what you can do is you can distract. You can distract the electorates with fear and anger, right? So what you have to do in a state like Oklahoma, maybe it's this way in Nebraska as well, but to get to win electoral majorities in the state of Oklahoma, what you have to do is you have to get a bunch of white working class people, that is a large part of our population, you have to get those people to vote against their own economic interests consistently, right? You have to get them to vote against, right, things like better public schools and things like better health care and things like more environmental regulations that would keep businesses from polluting their area, right? You have to get those people to vote against their own economic interests. How do you do that? Well, you do it by distracting. You're saying, look at those immigrants taking all of our stuff. Look at those Black Lives Matter, those woke people. Look at the DEI. Look at the CRT. look at the secularists and the leftists and the state-sponsored atheism that wants to take away your stuff and change our values. Doesn't that make you mad? Doesn't that piss you off? Don't you want to fight against those people? Pay no attention to these people who are actually benefiting from a tax structure in a situation in which we give vouchers to people who 90% of whom are already having their kids in private schools. Right? But let's give vouchers to make sure that everybody has choice. It's not giving people choice. It's not giving, like, those kinds of policies are failures because they only serve the interests of a particular group of people. But to win electoral majorities in that context, you've got to get all of those people who are being screwed over by that situation to say, oh man, woke people suck, right? Like the DEI and CRT and immigrants and the gay and lesbian agenda and all of those kinds of things. You have to distract. It also serves another purpose. In a place like Oklahoma, and I can just speak about national data, and I certainly speak about Oklahoma. In a state like Oklahoma, you actually have politicians who are actively trying to subvert functional institutions like, say, public education. You actually have them trying to subvert that so that they can promote things like school choice or vouchers, private schools and homeschool, which their constituents want, the funders want. And they can build reputations as, say, culture warriors that way. Well, saying things like we're putting the Ten Commandments back and saying things like we're putting Bibles back in public schools are a really effective way, sadly, of saying, look at all the stuff I'm doing, right? Look at all the stuff I'm doing. No, I'm not raising scores. No, I'm not like improving college placement. No, I'm not improving all of these other outcomes, but look at all this stuff I got. I got the Bible in public schools again. I got 10 Commandments and all those kinds of things. I brought national attention. It's a way that you distract from Republican failures, in my state at least, and it's also a way that you can distract from the situation in which you are trying to get a bunch of white working class people to get a vote against their own interests. You also have to make it so that you can maintain control without electoral majorities. And this is where I think you get to the subversion of democracy, right? How do you maintain control without electoral majorities? Well, you do it by voter suppression and rigging, by trying to change the electoral dynamics of your state. Is that familiar? Is that, you guys had some conversation about that recently to make sure that those lovely electoral votes all go to one group of people and not the other? You rig, you make sure that you reduce the number of polling places, that you require certain things, that you purge voter rolls that disproportionately affect a certain group of people. You make sure that you suppress votes in that way, and you also control the courts. You have to appoint lifelong judiciaries, right? And make sure that those get in place so that if you get elected out of office, which is likely, your people will still be in place forever and will be able to defend your values and make winning elections easier in the future. So how should we respond to this? I want to give you some examples of how I am trying to respond personally. I don't want to just give you thus saith Sam from the top of the mountain, right? Like I want to give you some insight into ways that I am trying to address this in my own life. So how I'm trying to respond. First, we need to, and this is not just for us, but this is for future generations, we need to reconsider what politics really looks like. I ask my students every semester how many of them are politically involved. And I teach a large 100-person social problems class, and so I always ask them, like, how many of you are, in any way, would you consider yourself politically involved? 90% of them say no. They're not leftist. They're actually pretty ideologically middle of the road. They're not motivated that kind of way. And I ask them why, and they always say the same thing. It's the same four things, actually. They say that they are, they don't know enough. They're not informed enough about things like national politics. They think, what would I do? Right? It's just me. They think, I don't want to be a jerk. And I don't want to be obsessed with things like being online all the time and like constantly debating those kinds of things. These are things that feel like they just got other things they would rather do. And I think that is actually a tragedy of our situation, because I think most young people, and maybe most people, Americans in general now, think politics is doom scrolling social media for 3 hours, reading some national news and getting into a fight with somebody, and then maybe voting in every 4-year presidential election and then saying, I did politics for the day. Like, I'm so political because I do that. That's not politics. That does not make you political, right? There's a great book called Politics is for Power by Eitan Hirsch, who's really an expert, one of the world's expert in election outcomes and political involvement and why people get involved in politics. One of the things he talks about is how the people who are the most likely to embrace this idea that politics is basically consuming massive amounts of national news and scrolling on social media, maybe getting into fights and expressively communicating my political positions without any other kind of political activity, happen to be liberal, educated, white, middle-class people, right? And we are giving that impression to young college people that is what politics is. And that's not politics. Politics is getting involved. Politics is organizing. Politics is ground game. Politics is having conversations, actual conversations with people, trying to persuade them, people who aren't already persuaded, to maybe see things a little bit more your way, right? To concede on some issue. Right, to understand that things are not so cut and dry, to see things from your perspective, and you understand them, you see things from their perspective as well. It requires us getting outside of our social media silos and algorithms and bubbles to actually have conversations with people who are different. It requires something a little bit more proactive than sitting there doom scrolling for 3 hours. We have to rethink what politics really looks like if this really does matter to us. We have to build cross pressures. One thing I'm trying to do is build what's called cross pressures in my own life. So that is a political science word. Cross pressures refers to the opposite of what is polarizing us now. What is polarizing us in the United States is not that people are moving towards political extremes. That really isn't happening. What is happening is that we are sorting, right? So our political identities are now causing us to sort all of our other social identities to where if you tell me one thing about yourself, I know all of the other things about you, right? So if you tell me that you drive a Prius, I have a pretty good idea, like how you vote, right? Like if I know what part of the country you live. I know, and if you tell me you don't drink Bud Light, I also know, right? Like, and it's those kinds of things. You tell me what kind of school your kids go to. If you tell me one of 10 things about you, I have a good guess. And that didn't used to be the case. That is a new thing over the last several decades. It used to be a lot more complicated. We used to have a lot more cross pressures. So cross pressures refers to the phenomenon where we are involved in groups that don't necessarily like align politically all the time, where you're going to meet people and interact with people and love people who actually may disagree with you on politics, right? That isn't the case. What is the case now is that most of us are involved in social media and volunteer organizations with people who look like us, think like us, vote like us, and share all of our values in that kind of way. And it creates a situation where we not only like don't know other people like that over there, we don't want to know them because we don't trust them and we just don't understand them. And how could we, right? That is a situation that is relatively new, and it is killing us. It is literally killing us. It prevents our ability to be able to cooperate as a nation, to overcome things that are really going to destroy us, like climate change or COVID, or all of the global crises that we face. Even disaster response that's happened within the last 2 weeks, right? We can't get anything done without somebody lying and sharing disinformation and blaming somebody else immediately for political gain. That is a situation where we're sharing disinformation constantly between our own kinds of silos. And so what I'm trying to do in my own life is I'm trying to create cross pressures. This is what it potentially could look like, right, at its worst, right? So we have on the right side, committed Christian, rural, conservative, Republican, all of those groups kind of align together, and people are at the middle and they feel intolerant of the other people on the left who are secular, urban, progressive Democrats. Now, I am a committed Christian. One of the ways that I am trying to overcome this in my own life, there would be other options for me if I wanted to. One of the things that I'm trying to do is I'm trying to become more like this, right? So I am trying to become a committed Christian who is like theologically orthodox and committed that way. I'm trying to become a committed Christian who has relationships, intentional. It doesn't happen by accident. It has to be intentional. I'm trying to have intentional relationships with people outside of these very neat political categories. So one of the ways that I do this is my wife and I, my family and I, we attend a church that is politically and theologically quite conservative. Now, I'm like, if you read the flag and the cross, you know that like the denominational groups that are most likely to subscribe to Christian nationalist ideology are in the realm of the very church that I'm going to, right? Like Pentecostal, holiness, charismatic kind of churches. We are not like that historically, but like we have relationships with these people. And every Sunday, I tell you, like I'm sitting there like, oh, what's he going to say? Like this is going to be really uncomfortable. It makes a lot of intense moments, right? Like, but I know the people sitting next to me, right? We are in community with those people, and we talk to those people, and we carpool with those people. And when we get sick, those people serve us. And when they get sick, we serve them, right? They know that I'm not insane. They know that I'm the Christian nationalism guy. They know that, right? Like, and so does it make conversations potentially uncomfortable? Maybe it does, but at the very least, we get an opportunity to understand each other and know each other so that I can actually see, okay, these are the values, these are the things that really scare these people. These are the things that these people really think. Where are they getting their information from? That's interesting, right? Where am I getting my information? It requires us intentionally getting outside of our bubbles to build relationships. I mean, really build relationships, not just with that uncle at Thanksgiving that you guys tolerate one another, right? Like you actually have to know people, to know them. So the third part of this is you want to talk to people who might be outside of my normal circles about what white Christian nationalism is and why it's a problem. Here's something that I've had to come to grips with over the last couple of years. There have been some surveys, Pew is collecting data on Christian nationalism, which I'm so grateful for. Public Religion Research Institute is also doing the same. And as part of their surveys, they're actually asking how many of you know anything about Christian nationalism. And I looked at a study, conducted a study recently as one of our scientific studies, and I wanted to know who's actually heard of this thing after all these years, after all this conversation that we've had about Christian nationalism. Who is it? Well, I found that the groups most likely to know anything at all about Christian nationalism are one, secular people. They know a lot. If you look at the left graph, that font is a little bit small. The people at the top there are atheists. These are people most likely to know about Christian nationalism. Atheists, right next to them are agnostics and non-Christian religions. Basically, the people at the very bottom are Christians, right? The people least likely to know about Christian nationalism are people who are Christians. Over on the right side, what you see there, and I'll just explain it for you, across the bottom is education. And look at the very blue line there and the very red line. What that shows you is that as education increases for conservatives, they're still the least likely to know anything about Christian nationalism. But for liberals, very liberal people, basically what that's showing you is the people who know the most about Christian nationalism are very educated liberals, very educated, very liberal people. What that means is, sadly, and this is sad for somebody who has been spending the last few years trying to help people understand Christian nationalism, is I've probably mostly been speaking to the choir, right, or preaching to the choir. I've been sharing that information with people who are already pretty convinced this is a problem. And I need to spend more time. I need to actually focus my energies on having conversations with people, both in terms of audiences, but also conversations with people who would be the most likely people to believe it, right? Like, who would be the most susceptible to it. Maybe not the true believers, maybe not the people who are writing books for Christian nationalism. I may spend my time elsewhere. But the people in the middle who are kind of ambivalent, they've heard a little bit about this, but they want to know more. I need to spend more time talking to those people. And we need to spend more time talking to people who kind of curious about this. What have you heard? And why do you know it's a problem? I want to give some helpful resources here. There are 2 books that are just now out. Obviously, Jim Wallace's book talking about Christian nationalism, hugely important and helpful as well. These are books written more about practically speaking, how to overcome Christian nationalism. Amanda Tyler's book comes out next month. She is the leader of Christians Against Christian Nationalism, and she's a wonderful person. And Caleb Campbell on the left, Disarming Leviathan. He is a pastor in the shadow of Charlie Kirk's Dream City Church in Phoenix, Arizona. And he really talks about reaching your Christian nationalist neighbors as like a mission field. If we would agree, and I think most of us probably would, that what you see in Christian nationalism does not resemble what you understand Christianity to be, that this is not normatively speaking something that you feel like is Christian, then why don't we treat these people like I would as a missionary? And I'd be a pretty crappy missionary if all I did on the mission field was go out and get into fights with people who disagree with me and talk about how dumb they are, right? Like, and make sure that like I silo myself and my family from all these people that I'm trying to reach with the message, right? Like I would want to go out and I would want to understand them. I would want to learn their language and learn their values and try to help bridge whatever I'm trying to talk about to these people so that they can understand. And he really takes that approach, is how do we get through all of that to help understand these people and they can understand us. Some more persuasive arguments. Tell them that Christian nationalism is racist. Maybe not. It's right up there with telling them they're Nazis. There probably is more going to be a conversation stopper. But you can show them that self-identified Christian nationalists really are racist and anti-Semitic and sexist and anti-democratic. They wear this on their sleeves. So the people who are embracing this openly are actually perfect exemplars. I mean, you could just pull their tweets and pull their books, right? Like, they're pretty obvious about it. Christian nationalism is not the pathway to prosperity. I've been gathering data like this for a long, long time. I'll just give you some examples. So these are, PRRI has collected all of the state level data about like states that subscribe to Christian nationalism and how much they do so. And on every indicator, and this is like, it's so reliable, like you could set your watch by, like it is one of the most reliable things that I can find, that states that are higher on Christian nationalism, that they have a higher population of people who like subscribe to this ideology, they are lower on just every outcome. Those states tend to be lower on every outcome of prosperity, on just about like education level, income level, what it's like to be a woman there, racial inequality, all those kinds of basically every metric, they are negative. And it's not necessarily Christian nationalism that has a lot to do with like education. It has a lot to do with income inequality, which provokes other questions. Why is Christian nationalism so prominent among places with lower education and bad income inequality? This is average life expectancy score by Christian nationalism. You see, as Christian nationalism goes up, life expectancy goes down. Here is, sorry, it's not life expectancy. I headed that wrong. It's infant mortality rate. As Christian nationalism goes up, infant mortality, right? Like if you're pro-life, are you somebody who claims to care about the lives of children, right? Well, Christian nationalism in the state means higher infant mortality. It doesn't mean like, it actually means more children shot by guns in the home. It means lower education, right? Like the future of those children is at stake and those kinds of things. Christian nationalism is not. There is no evidence to suggest across states that it is a pathway to prosperity in your state. In fact, there's more evidence strongly to suggest the opposite. And that is something that may be more persuasive than just calling them racists, right? Lastly, Christian nationalism is causing young people to abandon the faith. We find in study after study, it's actually one of the most common findings within the last within the last 2 decades of social science research that young people, if they have any left leanings at all, liberal leanings, which young people tend to do, what they are doing is they are seeing the marriage of the Christian right with Christianity over the last few decades. And they are saying, if that is Christianity, count me out. No, thank you. They may still love Jesus. They may still value religion and spirituality, but they will not identify with something that they feel like represents hate, represents intolerance, represents war and violence and anti-democratic subversion, right? So like that is something that we are actually having a growing, rapidly growing population of young people who say, no thank you to anything related to formal or organized religion, not because they reject Jesus necessarily, but because they reject what Christianity has come to mean. That is a problem. Lastly, here's the last thing I'm trying to respond, and this is the thing that I'll land the plane with. We need to systematically and rabidly target what political scientists call conflict entrepreneurs in politics. These are politicians who demonstrably do not raise more money, they do not pass more legislation or better legislation. They simply exist in politics to sow seeds of conflict and polarization. And they are part of the worst part of American politics. Unfortunately, we have in a lot of states, we have primary situations and primary systems where the goal is to primary your opponent, so you have to be as radical as possible and as loud as possible and vocal as possible. But to the extent that we are able, there needs to be a resounding message to send on both sides of this, right? Like that we want policy to be the forefront of this conversation. We don't want culture war issues. We don't want culture war issues. They have their place when it involves people's lives, of course, right? Like and I don't mean to suggest that those things are unimportant. But on issues that involve things that are largely symbolic, issues that are basically systematically targeted to sow anger and fear and ideas of cultural change and being upset about those kinds of things. Those kinds of conflict entrepreneurs need to be targeted and overcome. One of the main proponents of that, obviously, is Donald Trump. But I think anything that Trump represents and touches has to do with that kind of conflict entrepreneur style of politics. That is among the worst things that has happened within the last few decades, of course. So I will end it there, and hopefully we have great time for discussion, more questions. Thank you. Should I unplug this? Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Perry, for that deeply thought-provoking and very insightful presentation. I think one of the takeaways is, well, I'll just ask you a question. Can you tell Uncle so-and-so at the dinner table that he's a racist? Should we start there? No. Is that maybe the next step? I don't know. I think we need to think about what this research tells us. I think if nothing else, if that uncle or that, the uncle gets a bad rap. The white uncle at the dinner table, I think everybody is using the white uncle at the dinner table as a bad example. There's always that uncle. So start there, right? If the lowest common denominator about what is polarizing that friend, think of cross tensions, but start with data, right? I hope we will have this presentation, we'll have this research. Start with the things that you can't argue about, right? Infant mortality rate, these things tell a deeper story and provide us some kind of wiggle room if we're afraid to put the blue sign in the window, right? You might be afraid to put up the blue sign in the window because, that's too big of a step for me. But if you're having conversations with people that you know, friends, you can at least point to the research, decades-old research, right, that doesn't lie. So thank you for providing that. There's a lot more, I'm sure, behind Dr. Perry's research. If you're looking for that, we will definitely push out this information. As you leave, please get the books. But know that we are going to continue a conversation in just a few moments with a panel discussion. There will be a panel discussion with Reverend Jim Wallace, Reverend Jackie Lewis, and Samuel Perry. We will be asking questions and giving you the opportunity. So they'll speak on a few different points, but if you have questions, now is the time, right? Specific things that we're trying to talk about are how to leave here and not just be the choir, right? Because we're all the choir. What are some tactical things? What are some real things that we can leave here with? And maybe it's just 1, 2, 3. Maybe it's one way to have a cross tension that we add in our own circle, right? To move that Venn diagram maybe a little bit more broadly. Maybe you take one step. So come back after the break with a question, a burning question that you have, or maybe it's a question that your friend has or your neighbor has. If you don't want to name it, it's your own question. That's fine. Uncle so-and-so can be named again. But please do come with those questions. We want to leave here with a little bit more answers than we came with. So go take a bathroom break, get some refreshments, and come back here with some great questions. Thank you. Thank you.